Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Center for Truth and Justice International Conference on Human Rights and Accountability, the Aftermath of War. I will be the moderator for the very first panel titled Armenophobia, the Ugly Truth, Prevention of Racial Hatred and Discrimination, and ODIHR Mandate. We have 4 panelists today, one of whom is Ani Tatoyan, who is a CFTJ Law Clinic. The next presenter is Mr. Artak Beglaryan, State Minister from the Republic of Artsakh, as well as John Tehranian, Professor from Southwestern Law School, and Ms. Christie Edwards, Deputy Head, Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. The panel will begin by me reading short introductions of our panelists, after which each panelist will be given 15 minutes to present on the topic. At the end of our panel, our audience will be given an opportunity to ask questions. We have dedicated about 30 minutes to questions and answers. Ms. Ani Tatoyan is interested in international law. She's a CFTJ Law Clinic alumni 2021-2022. Ani has written on a thesis on the issue of responsibility for the crime of genocide and now studies the international crime of racism. After the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, she expressed readiness to participate in the work of collecting evidence on the international legal protection of refugees, which was carried out by the center. Ani's goal as a future specialist in international law is to protect human rights and to become the best specialist in the field. Mr. Artak Beglaryan, State Minister, Republic of Artsakh. Artak Beglaryan served as the Human Rights Ombudsman of the Republic of Artsakh between October 2018 and December 2020. Prior to that, he worked as a columnist at CivilNet, an analyst at Artsakh Today, and as well as a lecturer at the Artsakh State University. He also has worked as an assistant spokesman to the Prime Minister of the Republic of Artsakh and as an advisor to the State Minister of the Republic of Artsakh. He headed the Department of Human Rights Ombudsman staff prior to becoming the Human Rights Ombudsman. Mr. Beglaryan is the founder, president, and a member of a number of NGOs and civil initiatives. He is the president of Artsakh Blinds Union NGO. John Tehranian, a professor from Southwestern Law School. Mr. Tehranian is an author, academician, and an attorney. He's the Irvin Burkhalter Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School and the Bitterman Entertainment and Media Law Institute. He's also the founding partner of One LLP, an intellectual property and entertainment litigation firm with offices in Santa Monica and Newport Beach, California. A graduate of Harvard University and Yale Law School, John began his career at O'Melveny & Myers LLP. He has previously served as a tenured professor of law at the University of Utah, Queeney College of Law, and as a visiting professor of law at Loyola Law School. He's the author of dozens of articles, an interface between law and culture, and a frequent commentator for the broadcast and print media. Ms. Christie Edwards, who's the Deputy Head of Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Ms. Edwards is an internationally recognized published legal expert with over 22 years of experience working on international humanitarian and human rights law, gender international policy and advocacy, and international community development. Christie has led successful nonprofit management and implementation programs, strategic planning and grants management, and senior leadership roles at national and international levels with prominent INGOs and international organizations. Since 2017, Christie has served as the Deputy Acting Head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department of the OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, working on hate crimes, social cohesion, conflict prevention, peace building, and civilian protection. Previously, as the Director of International Humanitarian Law at the American Red Cross, Ms. Edwards has led ARC's legal education, public and youth outreach efforts on IHL, directly reaching over 60,000 people per year with a social reach of over 24 million. Finally, Ms. Edwards serves as the Executive Council and Executive Committee Governing Board of the American Society of International Law, co-chaired the 2021 American Society of International Law's annual meeting, and co-founded the same organization's Women's Mentoring Program with over 700 participants worldwide. Welcome to our distinguished panelists. It is my honor and privilege to moderate the very first panel of today's conference titled Armenophobia, the Ugly Truth, Prevention of Racial Hatred and Discrimination and ODIHR Mandate. As previously noted, each speaker will be given approximately 15 minutes. You will also be receiving signs notifying you of the times when it's 5 minutes left and when there's 1 minute left. With that, I would like to turn to our very first presenter, Ms. Tatoyan. Ms. Tatoyan, you have 5 minutes to talk about your experience as a CFTJ Law Clinic alumni.
Բարի օր բոլորին, շնորհակալություն։ Ադրբեջանը նախորդ դարի 90-ական թվականներից նպատակադրված զբաղվում է պատմական փաստերի կեղծարարությամբ, մասնավորապես Արցախի հանրապետության պատմությունը խեղաթյուրելով, Ադրբեջանի կողմից պատմական փաստերը կեղծելու, պատմական նորիրողությունները նենգափոխելու եւ միջազգային հանրության դրանք մատուցելու գործընթացներն իրականացվում են, ինչպես պետական, այնպես էլ հասարակական կազմակերպությունների, առանձին անհատների միջոցով, սակայն դրանք կառավարվում եւ ուղղորդվում է պետական իշխանությունը, իդեմս նախագահական ընտանիքի եւ Հեյդար Ալիևի հիմնադրամի։ Պատմական փաստերի կեղծարարությունը իրականացվում է հայատյաց քաղաքականության հետ մեկտեղ։ Կեղծարարությունն արտացոլումն է գտնում մասնավորապես ադրբեջանական դասագրքերում։ Նման քաղաքականությունը պատմական իրողությունները խեղաթյուրել, նպատակն է պատմական իրողությունները խեղաթյուրել եւ ստեղծել թշնամի հայ կերպար դպրոցահասակ երեխաների շրջանում։ Կատարված փաստահավաք աշխատանքների շրջանակներում աշխատել են Արցախից տեղահանված տարբեր մարդկանց հետ եւ նրանց շրջանում վախը Ադրբեջանից եւ ադրբեջանցիներից պայմանավորված էր նրանց հայատյաց քաղաքականությամբ։ Վկաներից մեկը, ով երկար տարիներ աշխատել էր որպես մանկավարժ եւ տիրապետում էր թուրքերենին, մտահոգված էր ադրբեջանցիների հետ խաղաղ ապրելու գաղափարից, քանի որ չէր պատկերացնում, թե ինչպես կարելի է ապրել մարդկանց հետ, ովքեր մանկուց սովորել են, որ հայը բացասական կերպար է, դասագրքերում հային որպես թշնամի է ներկայացրել եւ հետևելով նրանց լրատվությանը հայերի ու Հայաստանի մասին հրաժարվում երբևէ ապրել ադրբեջանցիների հետ կողք կողքի։ Ներկայացնենք մեկ այլ վկայի պատմություն, ով գրեթե 2 ամիս գերության մեջ էր եղել Ադրբեջանի Հանրապետությունում։ Նրա նկատմամբ կիրառվել էին տարբեր տեսակի բռնություն, այդ թվում նաև հոգեբանական։ Գերության ընթացքում նրան եւ մյուս գերիներին տվել են ռուսերեն լեզվով գրքեր, Ղարաբաղ, Ադրբեջան իստորիա եւ Գուբերնիա Երևան վերնագրերով։ Վկայի խոսքերով, այնտեղ ներկայացվածը չէր համապատասխանում իրականությանը, ամբողջովին կեղծարարություն էր, ինչպես Արցախի Հանրապետության, այնպես էլ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության մասով։ Բացի այդ, վկային, ով տիրապետում էր ռուսերեն լեզվին, պարտադրում էին կարդալ ու գրքերի արտանյութը թարգմանել իր հետ գերության մեջ գտնվող մյուս հայերին, ովքեր չգիտեին ռուսերեն։ Այս իրողությունների հետևություն անելով որոշեցինք մի փոքր ուսումնասիրել եւ ներկայացնել ադրբեջանական 5-րդ գրականության առարկայի 5-րդ դասանում առկա մի պատմվածք, մասնավորապես մեջ բերում եմ Պատմության դասեր, ուսուցիչը խոսում է Շուշի ամրոցից, նրա պատմական անցյալի անառիկությունից։ Ուսուցիչի խոսելու ժամանակ Մուբարիզը մտածում էր, ինչպես են հայերը գրավել Շուշին։ Այսպես մտածելով Մուբարիզի սիրտը վրեժխնդրությամբ էր լցվում։ Մեծանալուն զուգահեռ ավելանում էին նաև սրտում եղած վրեժի զգացողությունը։ Ականջին հայ զինվորի երգն էր հասնում, ով մեր Սարի Գելին ժողովրդական երգն էր երգում։ Հասկանում էր, որ թշնամին շատ մոտ է, մտնում է խրամարտ եւ թշնամուն միանգամից վերացնում։ Անդրադարձանք այս օրինակին, քանի որ այստեղ կա եւ պատմական փաստի կեղծարարություն եւ հայատացության քարոզ։ Արցախի Շուշի քաղաքը ներկայացվում է որպես ադրբեջանական, առկա է վրեժխնդրության քարոզ եւ ի վերջո Սարի աղջիկ հայկական ժողովրդական երգը սեփականացվում է Ադրբեջանի կողմից։ Ահա թե ինչ են սովորեցնում Ադրբեջանում 5-րդ դասանի աշակերտներին։ Կենսաբանության դասագրքերում նույնպես եւ շնչառական համակարգի եւ ծետանոթային համակարգի հետ կապված օրինակները կապված են Հայաստանի եւ հայերի հետ։ Օրինակ Զանգեզուրից ադրբեջանցիներին վտարելիս յուրաքանչյուր երկրորդի վիճակը վատանում էր ու արհեստական շնչառության կարիք էր զգացվում, ինչ էր կատարվում նրանց հետ։ Ադրբեջանի միջնակարգ դպրոցներում նաև արտադասանական ընթերցանության համար հետևյալ պատմվածքն է ներառվել եւ երաշխավորվել։ Զեյնալիի հայ պատմվածքը, որտեղ տեղ են գտել հետևյալ արտահայտությունները։ Հայերը ստոր են, պետք է նրանց բոլորին ոչնչացնել, հայերին պետք է ջնջել երկրի երեսից, հայերը շուն են, դաժան, կեղտոտ արյուն ունեցող եւ այլն։ Կարող ենք բազմաթիվ օրինակներ բերել, Ադրբեջանի կողմից հայերի նկատմամբ ունեցած ատելության վառ օրինակ է ռազմավարի պուրակը, որի դիմաց ադրբեջանցիների հարյուրավոր հերթեր էին։ 2020 թվականի սեպտեմբերին կատարվածը եւ Ադրբեջանի կողմից սանձազերծված պատերազմը ռասիզմի, այլատացության, հայատացության արդյունք էր։ 30 տարի շարունակ դպրոցական դասագրքերում պատմության կեղծարարության եւ հայատացության քարոզի արդյունք։ Ադրբեջանի հանրապետության խնդիրը ոչ միայն Արցախի հանրապետությունն է, այլ նաեւ ամբողջ հայությունը եւ Հայաստանի հանրապետությունը։ Հակառակ դեպքում ինչով էր պայմանավորված հայ գերիին տալ գիրք, որտեղ նկարագրվեց է պատմություն, որում Հայաստանի Հանրապետության մայրաքաղաք Երևանը համարվում է ադրբեջանական։ Ադրբեջանի սկիզբ դրած ցեղասպան քաղաքականությունը եւ վեր թվարկված մարդկության դեմ իրականացված հանցագործությունները կարող են հիմք դառնալ մի ամբողջ ժողովրդի բնաջնջման համար։ Շնորհակալություն։
Thank you, Ms. Tatoyan. And if we have Mr. Beglaryan online, I would like to ask our IT to please.
Seems there is a Zoom connection problem.
Correct.
Because I didn't get maybe 80% of the.
Yeah, same here. I think that's right. But I think people
Right.
on Zoom can hear us. I've just received a text saying people on Zoom can hear us. So I think
Okay,
they're-
thank you. Sorry for this. All right. Nice to meet you. And it's my honor to be hosted as one of the panelists of this conference. And thanks to the Center for Truth and Justice to organize this wonderful event. I'm sorry not to join you in Yerevan. Now coming to the main topic, Armenophobia. Actually, I will try to present some details, some reflections of Armenophobia to show the sequence and continuation and systemic nature of Armenophobia in Azerbaijan, which comes from decades and let's say the current and the modern phase of Armenophobia and hatred policy against all Armenians started since 1988, since the movement of since Artsakh movement and the movement of rejoining or reunifying of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh to Republic of Armenia. And because of that movement, some massacres and ethnic cleansing started firstly in Azerbaijan, in Soviet Azerbaijan, and then in Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region. And because of that, hundreds of thousands of Armenians, based on some academic calculations, up to 700,000 of Armenians, but officially more than 450,000 of Armenians have been ethnically cleansed in Soviet Azerbaijan and left the country. Thousands of them have been killed, injured, missed, etc. And then in 1991, war started against Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians and Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, which declared its independence in 1991. And the war ended in 1994. During the war, there are lots of tragic events from both sides. There are hundreds and thousands of missing persons, killed persons, injured persons, etc. But during the war also, the hatred policy was quite visible, which was somewhat logical because of the war consequences, because of the war situation, and it's logical why I'm saying, because in all war situations, regardless of any country, the level of hatred is quite high. It's not only Armenian-Azerbaijani situation, it's in all war situations. And after the war, the Azerbaijani authorities, and especially since 2000s, and especially during the Ilham Aliyev power, the systemic nature of Armenophobia again returned, and the government started to increase the level of hatred and to encourage at all levels, including the presidential level, the Armenophobic policy. And it's one of the tops of Armenophobic policy was 2016 war, April war against Artsakh Republic, and the densest reflection was 2020 war, 44 days war against Armenians. But before and after all of those events, there were many reflections recorded and reported both by us, by Artsakh and Armenian human rights ombudsman offices, and also some NGOs, both local, national, and also international level, and even also some reports of, for example, Council of Europe, European Commission against Racism and Intolerance. But I would say that there was no serious reaction by the international community. And that's why the 2016 war reflections and crimes, the war crimes also, and 2020 war crimes and crime against humanity, with all its reflections of Armenophobia and xenophobic policy, and also after 2020 war, the continuous policy by Azerbaijan by now is the failure of international community to do its responsibilities. The failure of responsibility to protect and responsibility to prevent. And I know that there are many mechanisms by the international community, including European Council, including OSCE, including UN, that they can and they could prevent many war crimes, prevent many tragedies, including even the war. But I'm sorry. But since there was no serious reaction, practical reaction by those organizations, by human rights organizations, both non-governmental and intergovernmental. That's why we had the war. That's why we had such kind of war crimes, and with the same, with the density and with the level of hatred. And that's why we have even by now the continuation of Armenophobic policy. There are some reports, not to spend some time on details. There are some reports by Artsakh Ombudsman, for example, the report of 2018, and you can check the report on Artsakh website, and some reports by Artsakh Ombudsman and Armenian Ombudsman on in 2020 and in 2021 on the examples of Armenophobic policy. I would bring the most popular examples. For example, in 2004, Azerbaijani officer asked in Budapest at the hotel in the sleep of asked an Armenian officer in sleep, and he took his jail in Budapest, but in 2012 the Azerbaijani government with the Hungarian government organized the extradition of Safarov, this criminal, and immediately pardoned in Azerbaijan and terrorized. Then the Azerbaijani Human Rights Commissioner said publicly, stated that Safarov should be bright example for all Azerbaijani youngsters. In 2016, during the war, during the 2016 war, there were lots of war crimes, including ISIS-style beheading of Armenian soldiers. And some of those criminals, I mean beheaders, published photos and videos how they beheaded and tortured Armenian soldiers. And then the Azerbaijani president publicly awarded those criminals for beheading Armenian soldiers. There were lots of examples how the Azerbaijani government encouraged such kind of criminal cases, including the 2014 saboteurs, Azerbaijani saboteurs invading, entering Artsakh illegally and killing an Armenian kid, 16 years old, kidnapping and killing. There are many examples how in class books Armenians are presenting as enemies. They are teaching their kids how to hate Armenians, accusing Armenians of all kind of Azerbaijani failures in history and now. There are many examples how they jailed Armenian with origin, but other country citizens entering Azerbaijan, and they jailed just at the airport, just because of being Armenian. There are many other examples how the Azerbaijani president and other state officials and public figures publicly said that Armenians, all Armenians, are enemies, giving some dehumanization wording, and again giving hate speech. And coming to the 2020 war, I guess everyone knows about many examples, how they targeted civilian population, civilian vital infrastructure, how they ethnically cleansed all the Armenian, I say, Artsakh, I mean Artsakh indigenous communities and indigenous people under their occupation. And they killed all civilians, or they jailed civilians and tortured them. Over 80%, more than 80% of civilians didn't return to homeland. They are either killed, even 90%. They are either killed or missing now in Azerbaijan, under Azerbaijani control. There are many examples how they tortured, how they killed, how they humiliate Armenian soldiers. There are many examples how they captured Armenian civilians and Armenian soldiers. There are proofs, video proofs and photo proofs, and then those soldiers and those civilians, captured persons, are missing now. And they say that we don't have any information about them. But we are sure that some of them, even now, are alive, or some of them, or many of them, are already killed, and they are missing deliberately. And all of those events during the war and after the war were organized with high-level hate speech at Azerbaijani social media and Azerbaijani media against all Armenians.
Mr. Beglaryan, you have 30 seconds left. Sorry, I was trying to warn you.
Thank you. And not just against soldiers, against combatants, but against Armenians. And after this war, by now, President Aliyev and Azerbaijani state officials continue the same policy. Just 2 months ago, Azerbaijan said that I'm proud that Azerbaijani youth has been brought up with hatred against Armenians. And that's why I am saying that now, just now, this risk of continuous war crimes or continuous crime against humanity is real, is genuine, and Azerbaijan is not preparing its society, its public for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beglaryan, and once again, congratulations on your Freedom Award. We will make sure you get your award delivered to you with your Artsakh delegation who's present at the conference. Next, I would like to invite Professor John Tehranian from Southwestern University. Mr. Tehranian, the floor is yours.
Sorry, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm still not getting the audio feed. I think we're still having on those of us who are online, having difficulty hearing the audio feed in the live room. But I understand that people remotely can hear me okay. So I'll go ahead and proceed. It's a real delight to be here. I want to thank the organizers of this event for putting on a great event, for inviting me to participate on this distinguished panel. And I also want to congratulate the CFTJ for the very important work that it's doing, particularly with its project in terms of documenting human rights abuses, which I think is an invaluable and critical part of the search and the attempts to seek justice and to enforce basic norms of democratic governance and the protection of human rights. I want to spend a special thank you to Annie Tolmoyan, who is a former student of mine who invited me to this conference and is among one of the organizers. So thank you, Annie, for the kind invitation as well. As I said earlier, gathering evidence is a critical process in creating a historical record by which to account for both the respect and the violation of human rights, to tell the stories of those who have suffered, and to also ensure that those who have suffered injustice, their plight is not forgotten, and that redress can come one day, whether now or in the future. My own personal area of expertise is in constitutional law and anti-discrimination law. I'll say just at the outset, I'm not an expert on the particulars of the war and this conflict and this ongoing conflict, but I do want to talk today about some of the key issues raised by the conflict, place them in a context of discussing the general norms of non-discrimination, respect for human rights, and for democratic governance. And I want to focus on two particular issues, cultural heritage and racial rhetoric. And the role of these two issues in the ideological and semiotic battle for the control of history, the portrayal of narratives of right and wrong, of legitimate and illegitimate claims, and the optics of the dispute in the region. And in a sense, these the important role that both issues of cultural heritage and rhetoric play in determining the nature of the claim rights to the land at dispute in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and how it impacts the people of Artsakh. As you know, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, has an Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, and it has a mandate to assist all OSCE countries to ensure their respect for human rights and the protection of fundamental liberties. Azerbaijan and Armenia are both members of the OSCE, and in large part, Armenia joined a number of years ago, some 30 years ago, in the hopes of helping to promote issues of human rights and justice. And unfortunately, we see these issues under threat right now in the conflict that's ongoing in the region. The values of the ODIHR, I think it's worth denoting some of them. But fundamentally, when they talk about norms of human rights and democratic governance, they're talking about things such as, number one, the rule of law, the idea that, that law is respected and applies to everyone on an equal basis, regardless of their identity, their nationality, their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, etc. Number two, the freedom of movement. This is a particularly important issue. Certainly was a serious issue during the Soviet era, these former Soviet republics. Number three, basic machinery of democratic governance. This means, of course, free and fair elections, as well as the rights of individuals to self-determination. Number four, the protection of fundamental liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. And number five, freedom from discrimination. This means freedom from racial, ethnic, gender, religious, and other forms of invidious discrimination. Now, as we all know, the most recent war in the region was launched in September of 2020. A ceasefire, trilateral ceasefire agreement was signed shortly thereafter in November 9th, 2020. But many issues remain that speak to some of these core values of the ODIHR in terms of evaluating respect for human rights. What are these issues? Well, some of them have been discussed already, but to lay them out, there are continuing problems with incursions into sovereign territory, particularly by the Azerbaijani government. There is the continued deportation, detention of prisoners of war, including many Armenian prisoners of war. There have been attacks against the provision of basic supplies and sustenance, including the cutting off of a gas pipeline to the Artsakh region during the winter as an act of retaliation. There have been accusations extensively documented involving the terrorizing and harassment of civilians who are not involved in the war or the conflict, accusations of beheadings and torture. And then finally, two issues that I'm focusing in on, destruction and misappropriation of cultural heritage, including the destruction of important ancestral graveyards and monuments in Artsakh. And I think these are, that we'll talk about a little bit about why these attacks are of particular significance. And then finally, very heavy-handed racial rhetoric that has incited hatred against Armenians. And these particular problems have been captured by the International Court of Justice, which ruled on a petition brought by Armenia in September of 2021 regarding violations of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The ICJ ruled in that in its dictates that came down in December of that year that it considers plausible the rights allegedly violated through incitement and promotion of racial hatred and discrimination against persons of Armenian national or ethnic origin by high-ranking officials of Azerbaijan and through vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage. Now, obviously, war is a terrible thing, and bad things happen on all sides. But as cited by the resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on humanitarian consequences of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, adopted on September 27, 2021, there have been alarming numbers of human rights violations committed on the Azerbaijani side. The council, or rather the assembly, condemned, quote, the deliberate damage caused by Azerbaijan to Armenian cultural heritage during the 6-week war, and what appears to be deliberate shelling of various churches, cathedrals, and the destruction of cemeteries, both during and after the conflict. And the assembly expressed concern that in light of the past destruction about the future of Armenian churches, monasteries, and cross stones and other forms of cultural heritage that have now returned under Azerbaijan control. In particular, the assembly talked about a narrative that has been perpetuated in Azerbaijan, including by officials as well as historians on the Azerbaijan side, promoting something called a Caucasian Albanian heritage, which they cite to as a historical presence that they call a predecessor to Azerbaijani presence in the region, as a way of kind of subverting the historical roots of Armenians in the region. And at the same time, the assembly also condemned the degree to which high levels of the Azerbaijani government continue to portray Armenians in an intolerant fashion, and pointed particularly to a military trophy park in Baku that had featured caricatures and stereotype mannequins of Armenian soldiers that promoted vicious and invidious racial stereotypes and promoted hate. Now, obviously, the taking of life and specific abuses against humans are oftentimes of paramount interest when we talk about human rights. But there is an underappreciated focus on acts that seemingly are nonviolent, but which have very significant consequences. And what acts am I talking about? Acts against cultural heritage and acts of rhetoric. In terms of cultural heritage, we've seen really two methods by which cultural heritage has been manipulated. And there's an important tie here to human rights and the impact over legitimacy and justice in the region. We've seen the physical destruction of many hashkars in the region. Of course, these are the memorial stone crosses that have been destroyed in cemeteries. But we've also seen the repurposing or misappropriation of Armenian heritage, being reclassified as Caucasian Albanian heritage that's linked to Azerbaijan as a way of erasing Armenian roots in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. We've also seen changes or quote unquote restoration work, for example, to the Cathedral of Shushi, which involved changes that Armenia has argued materially alterates the historical record. And here there's a tie, although these acts seem nonviolent and maybe don't seem directly related to the abuse of humans, the destruction of cultural heritage is an inherently violent act, and it's often a first step, if not a concomitant step, in actual violence. It sows the seeds of hatred, and in a sense, the elimination of a group's cultural heritage is akin to elimination of that group. Now, I don't want to make too much of this analogy, but I think it's worth noting one of the most important or terrifying acts of the destruction of cultural heritage in our lifetimes that got worldwide attention occurred in early 2001. What was that? It was the act that the Taliban took in Afghanistan when the Taliban blew up a couple of Buddha statues that had existed in the desert there for more than a century. What happened following these acts? Well, only a few months later, 9/11 happened. Now, I'm not drawing a direct line. I'm not saying the destruction of the Buddhas led to 9/11, but the kind of climate that supported the destruction of the cultural heritage for the Taliban, a non-Islamic heritage, right? The Buddhas, was the very same mentality that helped warrant and justify attacks of violence like 9/11. And of course, the Taliban was at the time in early 2001 housing Al-Qaeda. So there is a connection between the seemingly nonviolent acts of the erasure and destruction of cultural heritage and eventual acts of violence that seek obliteration. I grew up in Hawaii, and in Hawaii, there's another example of this. Part of Hawaii's history involves a history of colonialism, a history where the United States overthrew a sovereign country, the Kingdom of Hawaii. And part and parcel of that mission of overthrowing the monarchy of Hawaii and basically making Hawaii a part of the United States was a practice of the destruction of cultural heritage. These two main acts were very prominent in this process. That was, number one, the elimination of the Hawaiian language. The language captured the culture of the Hawaiian people, and it almost became an extinct language until it started becoming revitalized in the 1980s, and this has led to a revitalization of Native Hawaiian sovereignty claims. And meanwhile, also, the outlawing of a very significant piece of Hawaiian cultural heritage, the hula, the dance that Hawaiians historically had done, was actually outlawed, made illegal. And this was, again, part and parcel of the process of the destruction of the cultural heritage that also led to a process of almost elimination of an entire people, and certainly the conquest of a territory that remains in American hands. At the same time, the ICJ holding also talked about the heated racial rhetoric that has been coming, particularly on the Azerbaijani side, saying that such propaganda promotes racial hatred and incitement to racial discrimination and to acts of violence against groups of persons based on national or ethnic origin, and it can generate a pervasive racially charged environment within society. This particularly holds true when rhetoric espousing racial discrimination is employed by high-ranking officials of the state. Such a situation may have dangerous effects on individuals belonging to a protected group, and such damaging effects may include, but not limited to, the risk of bodily harm or psychological harm and distress.
Mr. Tehranian, you have 45 seconds left. Thank you.
In other words, what we say, especially when it comes from high-ranking officials, pervades society and oftentimes creates an atmosphere conducive to violence on the basis of racial hatred. One doesn't need to look too far from my own American perspective to see that. We had previously in power in the United States an administration that referred to Mexicans as rapists, that called COVID the Chinese flu, that incited very heavy-handed racial rhetoric. And as a result of that, we've seen a surge in attacks on individuals of Asian descent in the last couple of years, hate crime. We've seen terrorist attacks based on race in Buffalo, Charlottesville. We've seen a Muslim ban passed and approved by the United States Supreme Court. And so again, rhetoric, although it seems nonviolent, ultimately creates an atmosphere that is conducive to the actions, the terrible actions that can be taken that are abusive of human rights.
Thank you.
Broadly speaking, I'm not an expert on the situation, but I think it's very important to think about the nonviolent aspects of these human rights abuses and how they create an atmosphere that engenders greater intolerance for human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tehranian. And before I give the microphone to our next speaker, I do want to ask our members of the audience, as well as our virtual attendees, that you do have an opportunity to present a question. If you may have so, please submit it via Zoom chat, or if you're sitting in a room, you could write down the question in Armenian or in English and pass it down. So next I'm going to turn it to Ms. Christie Edwards, who is again the Deputy Head, Tolerance and Non-Discrimination OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights.
All right, well, thank you all so much for inviting me to join you today. Thanks so much to the organizers for having me a part of this discussion. Since you've already heard an introduction to the OSCE from the previous panelist, I won't go too much into introducing the OSCE to all of you. But I am going to be talking today about ODIHR's mandate to address all forms of intolerance, discrimination, and hate crime. And As many of you know, the OSCE has mandated the creation of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, particularly the T&D department, because democracy and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms are essential safeguards of tolerance and non-discrimination and constitute important factors for stability, security, cooperation, and peaceful development throughout the entire OSCE region, and conversely, that tolerance and non-discrimination are important elements in the promotion of human rights. And so, in basic terms, we work on these issues addressing all forms of intolerance, discrimination, and hate crimes to prevent conflict, to prevent the outbreak of violence between communities. And so there have been a number of OSCE commitments, non-legally binding, but political commitments on tolerance and non-discrimination, particularly around collecting data on hate crimes, creating specific legislation to address hate crimes, working with victims and civil society organizations, developing professional training opportunities for police, for law enforcement, for the judiciary, training all of these institutions on how to investigate hate crimes, and working with national points of contact on hate crimes to work on these issues domestically. And so, because we have a pretty much a heavily legal audience today, I want to go back to the definition of what a hate crime is, so we're all on the same page. Basically, it is a crime composed of two elements. So there has to be an underlying criminal offense, so something that is codified in the legal parameters within the country of something that is against the law within a criminal system. And this can be anything from threats to property damage, assault, murder, or any other criminal offense. But there also has to be a bias motivation that accompanies it. And so this can include intolerance, stereotypes, or hatred based on the victim's race, ethnicity, language, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, disability, gender, or any other fundamental characteristic. Basically, it has to be something about you that cannot be changed. Your skin color, your eye color, your age will change, so that wouldn't necessarily be considered a bias motivation if somebody discriminates against you because of your age. Your religion, the community that you were born into, while of course you can change your religion, it's not something that's easily changeable, so something that is an immutable part of who you are. And so my department, the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department, has a number of activities that we work with, as John mentioned, with participating states as well as civil society actors across the entire OSCE region, which, by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with the OSCE, it does cover all of North America, so Canada and the United States, all of Europe, and all of Central Asia. And so we work to address and combat hate crime through trainings on hate crime, monitoring and data collection, victim support, legislative drafting and review, working with the OSCE missions that are located all across the OSCE region. And we put out the annual hate crime report, which is the largest collection of data on hate crimes every year. There are additional challenges that come with this. As I mentioned, the OSCE commitments are not legally binding, they are political commitments, and many of the participating states that we work with have noted that there's often a lack of capacity reported by the authorities to identify, investigate, prosecute, and record hate crimes. We also know that reporting of hate crimes by victims themselves is highly underreported, and that can be for a number of different reasons, which I can go to maybe in the Q&A section. We think about 20% on average of folks who are that experience a hate crime actually report it to the authorities. And there's also a lack of capacity by the communities and civil society organizations to facilitate cooperation between the communities themselves and the authorities. And so in order to address some of these challenges, my department has put together a number of tools and resources and trainings specifically on these issues. So we have what we call our PACT program, the training program for prosecutors. We also have a program we call TACKLE, or training for law enforcement, so the police forces basically. And then InFact, which is our data collection and monitoring program, where we literally go in and work with all of your IT folks to create a better reporting system internally. So literally making sure that there's a checkbox or a drop-down menu for a police officer going in to investigate a crime, making sure that they can not just say, yes, this was a crime, someone was murdered or assaulted, but is there a box saying, was this because of anti-Semitism? Was this because of racism, xenophobia? Was this because of gender? Making sure that all of that data is available to be collected, which then gives the prosecutors, obviously, an opportunity to prosecute for those specific elements. We also work very, very heavily with organizations and with the governments on victim support. So we've recently just concluded a 2-year project creating a very large system of tools and resources specifically enhanced to develop the capacities of all of these different entities to provide excellent victim support from a trauma-based response mechanism, making sure that victims receive all of the best care that they possibly can when they experience this kind of an issue. We also have a number of publications, smaller ones and larger ones. We have a bunch of hate crime fact sheets. These are smaller, 4-page on average publications that just go through the basic elements of what a hate crime based on anti-Semitism is, or what a hate crime against Muslims, or against Christians, or against people with disabilities, on racism and xenophobia, etc. And we work very closely with members of different religious communities to create security guides. So specifically with the Jewish communities, Muslim communities, we've put together another resource and tool on hate crime victims in the criminal justice system. So making sure that the police and law enforcement folks have the ability to respond effectively. And additionally, I forgot to mention up here, we have a number of educational policy resources. So for educators who want to make sure to include some of these training programs, we make sure to give them additional tools and resources here. One of the biggest areas we also work on is working with civil society organizations. And for us, coalition building is one of the best ways in which we can bring different community actors, different community groups. This is obviously something that many folks here from the United States will be familiar with, bringing together different communities to work on issues of hate crime that they wouldn't necessarily be able to accomplish on their own. This is one of the biggest reasons why the Matthew Shepard Act, or the hate crimes law, was passed in the United States, because it brought together not only LGBT activists, but Jewish communities, African American communities, and other communities that all banded together to say, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your identity is, but a hate crime is absolutely unacceptable for anyone. And protecting a young gay man who, in Matthew Shepard's case, was murdered because he was gay, is equally as important as protecting the life of a young Jewish person or a young Muslim person, or anyone who would face persecution based on their identity. So I want to give you a little bit of facts and statistics on our hate crime report. As I mentioned, it is the largest data set in the world that's published annually on hate crime. We have about 42 out of our 57 participating states that contribute their official data. Many of them, 36 of them, supply us with official statistics. Some of them give us a broad overview, but most of them give us official statistics. And 22 out of the 42 that we receive data from break it down by bias motivation. And so that's really helpful for activists, for civil society organizations, and for lawyers such as yourselves to be able to have a great dialogue with their communities and with their government officials to understand what are the biggest challenges and needs of different communities, because we know that a certain number of hate crimes are committed every year based on racism and xenophobia, or on Christian bias, or on Muslim bias. We also receive a lot of information, actually even more so than our state data, from civil society organizations across the world. And we've done some trainings actually here in Armenia, actually a lot of trainings for civil society organizations as well as for the police and the prosecutors. So we've been working with them over the last few years on how to accurately investigate, report, and document hate crimes. And so we get quite a bit of data from civil society that cover 46 of our 57 participating states. And finally, we receive quite a bit of information from other partner IGOs, so UNHCR, for example. They give us a lot of information, particularly around issues of racism, xenophobia for migrant communities. So from our civil society friends, last year for 2020, we received over 7,000 incidents. So these are reported incidents, but not maybe have been investigated by the police, but not always. So we call them incidents as opposed to a verified crime that has been documented by the police. As you can see, the vast majority of them were based on issues of racism and xenophobia. We have a large number also that were based on anti-Semitism, anti-LGBT, anti-Christian, etc. So you can see where, because, and I think in many of these crimes that were documented as issues of racism and xenophobia, they could be from a wide variety of different communities. They don't always necessarily break it down or mark, multiple boxes on that drop-down menu on who exactly is the target of that racism. But we know that this is definitely an issue of concern for many of the participating states. This is just another way of taking a look at the data here. We know that, or some of the data that we get, some of it is just, this was a crime that was reported to us based on racism and xenophobia, but we get a large number of those that actually give us a description, so we know exactly what happened. We know the story of this particular individual walked through a park and was beaten because they are Roma, or beaten because they attended a pride parade and someone thought that they were a member of the LGBTI community. You can also see in the second column here the number of victims affected by these incidents and the average number. But the data, if you take a look at our website, and I think it's the next slide, yeah, if you take a look at our website, it will also break down the information for you based on what kind of a crime it was. So was it an act of violence against a person, or was it a crime against a piece of property? So we receive a lot of information based on the targeting of a mosque or a synagogue or a cemetery, as you've heard previously, cultural property that is particularly targeted as a way to send a crime send a message to a particular community. And I think, as we've heard a number of times today, hate crimes are message crimes. They are particularly message crimes to the individual, but as well as the community in which they are a member of or perceived to be a member of, that you're not welcome here, that you're not wanted. And so effectively addressing these crimes, effectively investigating and prosecuting and providing support to victims of hate crime is particularly important for social cohesion, for peace building, for bringing communities back together before conflict breaks out or after a conflict has resolved, to say that we want to move forward in a community of peace, and making sure that we are able to create these structures for a peaceful community in the future. So thank you. I think I'm running almost out of time here, but happy to answer any questions if you all have some.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. If you do have any questions, please make sure to pass it to our volunteers who will be presenting them to me. But one question I do want to ask, and Ms. Edwards, and you did mention in your presentation, is the fact that there's a very low reporting from the victims themselves. And coming from the Center for Truth and Justice, an organization that's pretty much collecting evidence from the victims, we have definitely witnessed that issue ourselves, and it takes a lot of report building, trust, especially on some of the most horrific crimes, for example, from the prisoners of war. So, but I do want to hear if there's any other methods that are being used, or what's the issue in your line of work?
Sure. So there's a number of reasons why folks don't report, and this can vary fairly widely, depends on the community that we're talking about here. But some of the reasons, as you mentioned, trust in the police forces themselves. If folks don't believe that they will be taken seriously, if they feel like the police might, in fact, also be discriminatory, that might prevent them from wanting to go to the police. It can also be that in some communities, particularly for the LGBTI community, in not every country, it might not be legal for them to be publicly out, or if their migration status or their legal status in a community, particularly for migrant communities, if they have not been regularized, they might fear to go to the police because they might fear to be deported or face some criminal or administrative sanctions from the government. So there's some different reasons why they might feel like there might be some legal barriers before they can even walk through the police officer's door to report that crime. Additionally, I would say there are some communities that don't always receive the best treatment once they're going through the process. And so this is why we created the victim support tools and resources, because, and I think many of the folks here that have ever worked on domestic violence issues or gender-based violence have worked on and experienced that having someone who's specially trained in how to work with a victim who has experienced this really horrific crime. It's not that you just got beaten up or you got raped or something happened to you, but it was specifically targeted to make you feel like you are the worst person on the planet, that you are absolutely unwelcome. And so if a police officer isn't trained to understand the victim psychology around that particular crime, it can often further traumatize the person who has experienced that crime. And so it's terrifying for someone who has experienced that to want to go and share that story if they don't feel like that they're going to be necessarily taken seriously. So there can be a number of different reasons why going to the police and reporting is not always the first thing that they'll do. But that's also why great organizations, community-based organizations, are a really wonderful resource in many of the participating states to support these efforts.
Thank you. We actually have a lot of questions specifically for you, so I would probably not put on the mask yet. Yes, the audience, especially people residing in Armenia, anyone from OSCE, they do have a lot of questions. So the first one that I'm going to ask is, what was the OSCE ODIHR's role in information training with respect to the trials of Armenian POWs in Azerbaijan, if whether such training has been done in the recent times?
So, to my knowledge, we haven't done specific training on these issues. I briefly covered our TACKLE program, so our training for law enforcement officers. And so this is a program that we offer with as many of the participating states as will be willing to participate in this training. It's actually a training program that is integrated into the training program for national level police. So we establish an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding, usually with the Ministry of Interior, sometimes the Ministry of the Judiciary, depends on where the police forces sit administratively within the government. And then we begin a training of trainers program. So we train the police trainers on recognizing, reporting, recording hate crime, and making sure that they have, the nerdy data, drop-down menus, et cetera, to be able to accurately record hate crimes when they are reported to them. And then we also specifically work with prosecutors. So a lot of times what we've found is that you might do a great job of training police, you might do a great job of training prosecutors, but if they are not talking to each other, and if their systems don't align, then some of that information gets lost in translation. If any of you have worked in the criminal justice system, you know sometimes where those balls can drop. So what we like to do is to bring those trainers together, the people responsible for creating those systems together, and have them come into the room, as well as sometimes with civil society too, to say, okay, where are the barriers here? What is it that is preventing a victim from coming and reporting to the police? When they get to the police, what tools and resources and training do the police need to be able to effectively investigate a hate crime? Do they understand what all of the different potential bias motivations might be? Do they understand the signs of what would indicate that there was a biased motivation? Were there slurs? Was there graffiti? Were there certain symbols used? Did they say something? Was it at a gay pride parade? Was it at, Friday prayers in a Muslim community? Was it in a Jewish cemetery? There are certain ways to recognize that there is a specific bias indicated. And then once the police are actually able to document these bias motivations, in addition to the underlying crime, then the prosecutors will take that information, and they need specific training to make sure that they are able to effectively prosecute for that. Now, that will depend on what the law actually is. Is there an enhanced penalty for a hate crime? Is there a specific law that gives additional criminal ability to, put someone in jail if you've murdered someone, you might get 20 years in jail, but if you've done it because of a hate crime, maybe you would get life imprisonment. Whatever the case might be, so that the prosecutors know what to ask for from a judge. And then as much as we're able to, we also like to have these conversations with judges so that they are too able to understand what is a hate crime, what are the bias motivations, and how do you effectively rule on a case like this if it's trial by judge rather than maybe by jury.
So I guess a follow-up question to this, since you did mention that you're not aware of any specific trainings done like in the past on this, the POW topics, do you know, because it's such a hot topic, at least in Armenia, and I know that maybe not as a hot topic, or it's kind of a hidden type of a topic in Azerbaijan, but are you aware of any type of trainings that are scheduled in the next several months? Sorry, I know it's an extremely important question for our audience, which is why I'm trying to be specific. So if you do have that knowledge, please share with us.
Unfortunately, I don't, because this is working on POW issues is not something that my office particularly works on, as that would typically fall within an IHL framework, and we're not working on conflict-related trials. So I don't know, but that might be a question for, I know some other really fantastic criminal justice organizations that are working on these issues.
Thank you. One second. Again, a very specific question, but I do want to ask, and if you have the information, yes. So the question is about the meeting of the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs with President Aliyev in Baku right after the 44-day war. And the question is, was there any sort of a reporting or repercussions, political or otherwise, done for the fact that Mr. Aliyev simply, resorted to violence as opposed to the procedures established by the Minsk Group?
Yeah, apologies. My office doesn't work on those issues particularly. That's held within the Secretariat based in Vienna. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to point you to some resources that they could check out based on our conflict.
I do have one question for me, I guess. As you noted, the reports that are being produced by your office on hate crimes and all of that. So for example, for an organization such as the Center for Truth and Justice, when we come across such testimonies, this might be a very simple question, but what is the process, for example, of submitting those reports to your office? Is there a specific mechanism, or does that have to does the testimony have to be collected through your representatives only?
No, I'm so glad you asked. Well, the website isn't up there anymore, but if you Google hate crimes OSCE or hate crimes ODIHR on the website, there's a link for where you can submit those reports. And certainly we would welcome any reports that your organizations are collecting, any data that you that you have that you would like to submit, and those would be, I think, if you remember that long graph, the 7,000 incidents that we receive, those are taken very seriously. Our team does review every single one of those incidents, and so there's a specific methodology that we might come back to you with some questions and get some further data from you if it's not included in your initial email, but we would definitely welcome any reporting of incidents that you have.
And kind of like a follow-up question, but because in today's, reporting, social media, the open source evidence, and by open source, for those of you who don't know, is pretty much evidence that was, for example, during the war shared via Telegram channels, on Instagram, all of that. Does your office also, I guess, voluntarily, like when you come across such evidence, do you include it in your reports, or again, does that have to come through a specific channel? Sorry, is there a specific group assigned to that? Because the reason why I'm asking is because a large portion of our evidence, not just our evidence, just in general, war crimes in this scenario, experiences that has come through those sources.
Sure. So we have a small team. They are quite mighty. So we don't go out and do proactive research, but a lot of times people will literally just send us a link to a news article. And if we can verify that that was in fact a hate crime based on our methodology, we will of course include it. So you don't have to write us a super, super complicated email. You can just write us a very short email, just say, hey, making sure you saw this. And the more detail you can, give us, that would make it a little easier, because we do have to go through many thousands of them. It'll make it a lot easier to include that information. But yeah, you don't have to give us a long, complicated, fact sheet of an incident. You can just literally send us a link.
I have one more. Sorry, I myself am very interested in this, so I have one more question. Has there been a time when a specific crime was reported, there was a major issue with enforcement? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, I know that there is no specific executive enforcement body. This is like advisory, right? Procedures that are happening. But has there been a time when the office was a little bit more involved, I don't know, in establishing some sort of repercussions, sanctions, or something of that sort to make sure that a specific crime is addressed properly in that specific country?
Yeah, so we don't have an enforcement piece of the organization, but what we often will do, particularly if there's a crime of real political or cultural significance, that can be raised at the political levels. So when representatives of our office are traveling to Armenia, for example, or Serbia, or Azerbaijan, or Kazakhstan, whatever the country is, we will provide talking points for our senior level officials or for our Secretary General to raise it at the highest levels with the Prime Minister, the President, to say, hey, we've noticed that this incident happened. We encourage you domestically, because the governments ultimately have the responsibility to investigate and prosecute these crimes. It's the responsibility of the government. It's not ODIHR's responsibility. It is the government's responsibility to investigate and prosecute these crimes. But we will encourage at a political level for the governments to do everything within their power to effectively address these issues domestically.
And do you think we will ever reach to a point where some sort of sanctions, whether that's economic, even small, will be kind of created, as opposed to, let me go back a little bit to provide a little bit of background. Whenever we have a crisis in the world, for example, with the Artsakh or with the war in Ukraine that's kind of ongoing, there's a lot of questions about the role of the international organizations and their effectiveness. So I guess my point is, has there been discussions about creating such enforcement mechanism, even limited capacity, to have some sort of a say, some sort of smaller, you understand what I'm trying to say. I think it's important to give more credibility also to the organizations.
There's definitely conversations going on about accountability mechanisms. Unfortunately, that is not something that will ever happen within the OSCE because of the way that we are created. The OSCE, unlike other international organizations, actually has no legal personality. And as a lawyer coming into the organization over 4 years ago, this kind of blew my mind. Unlike the UN, which has the ODIHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR, the ICSCR, these legally binding documents, the OSCE has nothing. It started out as a conference. And so every single commitment that happens and every decision that happens within the OSCE literally has to be by 100% consensus of all 57 participating states. Now, if you've ever gone to a family reunion, you know you're not going to get 100% consensus on almost anything. So getting a political commitment passed is really, really challenging, but it does hold a lot of political weight when they do happen. And so creating an enforcement body or an accountability body, probably not something that's going to happen within the OSCE framework, but I know that many of our colleagues, our partner organizations, the United Nations and others are very much working on. And I know that there's a lot of political support by other governments to make sure that this can happen. The OSCE obviously has a huge interest, vested interest in providing tools, good practices, support to these kinds of mechanisms when they do happen. Anything from fair trial procedures to legislative reviews and other forms of capacity building support. It just, the creation of such an accountability mechanism would be, in my personal view, very unlikely to happen because of the structure of the organization itself. Doesn't mean it won't happen in general, just not within the OSCE.
Thank you, and I just pretty much hearing your answer, I think it's kind of important because a lot of the things you mentioned, for example, about the OSCE, I didn't know some of the details. So public education and awareness about exactly what the OSCE could do is definitely going to be essential. My next question is for our other panelists. I'm just going to give you a little break. Mr. John Tehranian, from actually our fellow Garine, who has arrived from Argentina. So the European Court of Human Rights gave a judgment that the public domain of the Armenian genocide carried out by the Turkish politician Perenchak did not imply the promotion of racial hatred. Do you think that this judgment opened the door for Azerbaijan to act with impunity? Mr. Tehranian, were you able to listen into the question? I could repeat if necessary.
Yeah, could you repeat it?
Sure. So the European Court of Human Rights gave a judgment that the public domain of the Armenian genocide carried by the Turkish politician Perenchak did not imply the promotion of racial hatred. So do you think that this judgment opened the door for Azerbaijan to act with impunity?
So I think I caught part of the question regarding the European Court of Human Rights and its judgment on the Turkish historian who denied the Armenian genocide and the impact, arguing that that did not constitute promotion of racial hatred. So yes, I do think that's a dangerous ruling. At the same time, I don't think it necessarily allows Azerbaijan to act with impunity because lawyers always have good ways to distinguish one case from another. And I think immediately that case is not necessarily on point because really that was about, promoting a theory that obviously is bunk. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily implicate the present situation in Azerbaijan. Where there may be other aspects of what Azerbaijan are doing that are distinctive from what the Turkish historian did. But I do agree it's a dangerous ruling. I mean, one could say that, well, if revisiting facts from history and denying genocide is not a form of racial hatred, then eliminating crosses or hashkars and suggesting that historical markers were from a fictitious Caucasian Albanian dynasty as opposed to markers of Armenian heritage. You could argue they are similar. So yes, I do think it's a dangerous precedent. I don't think it's completely outcome determinative, and I think it's important to note that. That here, there are distinguishing factors, including actual physical destruction of actual existing pieces of cultural heritage that exist, in real life. But yes, it's dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tehranian. I think I'm almost done with my questions, unless the audience has another or something else that they would like to add. I do want to ask upon. Yeah, we do have one question.
If
you phrase it shortly. We have a question from the audience, Ms. Yelena Ambartumian.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. I had a question because while I do understand that the issue of POW detention treatment is an issue under IHL, International Humanitarian Law, my understanding was, and I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding was that the Armenian POWs and civilians were being prosecuted under Azerbaijan's national law. And so could you please clarify this? And if so, why isn't there an understanding that that would be part of your organization's domain? And is that because your specific office needs Azerbaijan's cooperation in order to train prosecutors? And if that's the case, then is there any report that your office would be considering to look into whether or not these trials can be fairly conducted? Because I myself am from Azerbaijan, I was born in Azerbaijan, and anyone with familiarity with the situation can understand that it's very difficult to have a fair trial for anyone of Armenian ethnicity in Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm not familiar with the cases, unfortunately, so I wouldn't be able to give you a real specific answer there. I haven't heard that these individuals are being prosecuted for hate crime in particular, so it's not something that we track. As a general issue under IHL, it depends on what individuals would be prosecuted for under these national laws. And I think, as we're seeing even this week in Ukraine, domestic authorities can prosecute prisoners of war for war crimes that exist. So there is a framework that does exist, but without having taken a look at what these individuals were being prosecuted for and whether fair trial proceedings were in fact enacted. And there are organizations, obviously like the ICRC and many of these other organizations that are going in and looking at detention facilities, looking at conditions of detention, monitoring the fair trial proceeding aspects of these trials. These would be organizations that I think would probably take a closer look. Unfortunately, it doesn't fall within ODIHR's mandate. Again, we fall, the creation of our office and the specific topics that our office looks at fall within specific OSCE commitments, and working on prisoner of war issues is not one of them. We do have tools and resources. Some of my colleagues in other departments, in our democratization department and our human rights department, do have some really great tools, generally, not specifically on this circumstance, that do give an overview of best practices and good practices on detention facilities, as well as fair trials. So, you know, we of course recommend to all governments, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and everyone else, that they take a look at these tools and resources. We certainly offer them every time we have a discussion with the government officials, whenever we're going to visit or when we're having conversations in Vienna. And so we always want to recommend to the participating states that they take advantage of these tools, because that's what they mandated us to do. But unfortunately, the POW issues in these particular trials is not something that I'm specifically familiar with, so I don't want to give you the wrong answer.
I just have a quick comment, like, if I may, because you did ask about the POW and you're saying that it's not within the OSCE's, realm of work. But if the person became a prisoner of war just because of his nationality, which is something that, one of the characteristics, wouldn't that possibly, allow the OSCE to get involved through that pretty much route? Because it's not just a conflict, a violent situation, but the person became a prisoner because of his nationality.
So there we would actually go back to the legal definition of a hate crime. So there has to be an underlying criminal offense plus a biased motivation. So it depends on whether or not there is a law under Azerbaijan's criminal framework that allows for taking someone prisoner based on certain characteristics. So we would have to actually look at that to see if that meets the criteria. I will say that because there are specific rules on what constitutes a prisoner of war under international humanitarian law, and every single country in the world has signed on to the Geneva Conventions, that would be the legal framework that would be much more carry much more weight and have much more binding authority. And I'm absolutely certain that our ICRC colleagues will be having conversations about that as to whether someone was, appropriately charged with as a POW for specific crimes. And so, what if under a very sort of narrow circumstances, ODIHR could be involved? It would still probably carry a lot more weight if an organization such as the ICRC or another humanitarian organization that's working on a much more robust and well-implemented legal framework was actually able to go in and have that conversation.
Thank you. And I'm going to have my very last question before we adjourn. This is for Mr. John Tehranian. This is for you. I'm actually going to be combining two questions into one because they were similar. But the questions are the intentional targeting of cultural cities that are not military objectives, for example, cultural heritage. These are being destroyed. These are open targets pretty much for the Azerbaijanis. So what type of response, in your opinion, is needed, especially to prevent the destruction, at least, of cultural heritage, given the fact that we also have the provisional measures decision from ICJ back from December 2021?
Well, yeah, I think what's needed is actual enforcement of the provisional measures from the ICJ and greater outreach from the international community to condemn those actions, particularly when there's absolutely no legitimate claim of military relevance to the destruction. I think in all those situations, the international community needs to come together and condemn those actions and note very forcefully that the attack against cultural heritage is indeed an inherent human rights violation, and it's oftentimes a predicate to or part of a broader ideological agenda that oftentimes results in violence and the violation of human rights. So I think that's the kind of response that's needed, and I think conferences like this, as well as the evidence gathering that organizations such as CFTJ is doing, play a vital role in illuminating these issues and giving greater voice to them.
Thank you very much. And I do want to thank you all for your participation at our very first panel of our inaugural conference on human rights and accountability. And thank you for joining us on this incredible 3-day journey. So thank you. Please, I invite you all to go to the first level and to proceed to lunch.